Welcome back to Spector Creative's channel and our ongoing series of all the modern Star Wars figures. And the next release, as we go in chronological order, combines two concepts: carrying cases and Wedge Antilles. Why do I bring attention to both of these concepts? Well, they are reoccurring themes, shall we say, in Star Wars collecting. Let's look at carrying cases first, because these were very prominent in the vintage line, unlike Wedge Antilles, which we'll get to that in a moment. There were lots of carrying cases in the vintage line, some shaped like boxes, some shaped like Chewbacca's ammo clips, some shaped like blasters. One of my favorites was the Rebel Transport, which, yes, I know is sort of technically a vehicle, but it was actually marketed as also a carrying case because it could fit so many different figures inside of it, and it worked very well as a, with all those little compartments, a way to store all of your stuff and all of your figures. But the most famous carrying case of all was obviously the Darth Vader head. This has been remade in tons of toy lines in different scales, all paying homage to it, and it had a very cool, unique, simplistic design. You opened up the case, and there in the shape of Darth Vader were all of your figures held together or held back by a little bar with their names on it. And then for Return of the Jedi, we got an update of this with C-3PO, where same concept. Once you opened it up, then all your figures could live inside. Basically, they really did strike gold with this concept, no pun intended, because it was really one of the most memorable toys in the Star Wars line, one of these carrying cases. I was lucky to have both Darth Vader and C-3PO as a kid. In fact, I still have them, and it's where I keep my figures. Power of the Force 2, which started the modern line, was not shy at all about carrying cases, both the cube-shaped, and they brought back C-3PO because the tool was still available from some of the foreign distributors of Kenner product. And it was recast and now in not quite shiny plastic or back metallized like it used to be, and it was given a feature of electronics with lights and sound. The next case, though, is more important and why we're covering it. Because this case, one, it was shaped like the Millennium Falcon, but it also came with a figure, and that's why we're covering it, because this series is all about the figures. And what figure was it? Well, it was this one, Wedge Antilles, which some of you out there may be like, who in the world is Wedge Antilles, and why does he come with the Millennium Falcon? We're going to go into that because that's actually a personal story of mine as well. Now, Wedge came on this oddly shaped card back because it had to fit into the cockpit of the Falcon. And as far as who Wedge is, well, he's not the pilot of the Millennium Falcon, but he is a pilot. He's a Rebel pilot. In fact, he's probably the number 2 Rebel pilot under Luke Skywalker. So allow me to explain a little bit for those who may be like, who is this guy? Or you may be a toy expert and a Star Wars expert, and of course you know who he is. So Wedge has the distinction, boy, that was terrible, of being in all 3 original Star Wars movies. And, well, he also shows up in the very last of the Disney movies, much, much older. And, in fact, even shows up in Rebels as a recruit, shall we say. And one of the more interesting things about his history, he's actually been played by 2 different actors. There's Wedge, and then there's this guy sitting next to Luke in the briefing room, who's often called Fake Wedge. Well, he's actually an actor, Colin Higgins, who was originally cast as Wedge and then replaced by Dennis Lawson to play Wedge in all of the X-Wing scenes. So, yeah, Colin Higgins is an entirely different actor altogether.
It's an entirely different kind of flying.
And for many years, people didn't think that was Wedge talking to Luke in the briefing scene, but according to the script and in the radio drama, it is. It was just a different actor, so it's often called Fake Wedge. This is the actual Wedge, who played, again, by Dennis Lawson, who played him in all other appearances as well as in the sequels. And Dennis Lawson also redubbed Colin's lines. So Wedge is a character who has, oh god, pun, wedged his way into the hearts of a lot of fans. Because, well, he's the only Rebel pilot, other than Luke, to appear in all 3 movies. And it's taken a long time, but he's finally, 40 years later, gotten his share of action figures and merchandise. He's one of those characters that if you really knew the movie well in '77, you kind of might have expected him to have gotten a figure, because he had a very prominent role. He was also the only other Rebel to survive the destruction of the Death Star. Well, except for that Y-Wing guy, but we never know who's in there. I guess it's Ken Farlander if you follow the X-Wing video games, but that's not important. Biggs and Wedge and Luke were kind of the three main X-Wing characters. And I had a very interesting story about this. So in high school, I was very much involved in the theater department in drama. And I was involved with one of the shows called Noises Off, which, if you've never seen the show or the movie based on it, you should really check out the movie. It's hilarious. It's got Cousin Larry in it. Anyway, so I wasn't in the show, but I was in the back of the show. I was the stage manager. See, there's my name squashed underneath everyone else who had bigger roles. But it was a lot of fun. And one of the things I did as stage manager was I was in charge of props. And one of the props for the show is a bunch of insurance forms. And the director wanted me to fill them out so they looked, on stage like they were actually filled out. So I just started writing Bob Johnson and, generic names. And my best friend in high school, Brian King, was helping me fill them out. And he put Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles as the names on the forms. And I was like, who the heck is Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles? And Brian was like, aren't you a Star Wars fan? I'm like, yeah, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but I've never heard of Biggs Darklighter or Wedge Antilles. So he went on to explain how much of what I said earlier, that Wedge was the only other X-Wing pilot to survive the Battle of Yavin and was in all the other movies. And this, for me, was mind-blowing, and I realized that Star Wars was much bigger than I ever realized it. It wasn't just about Darth Vader. This was also the time that Power of the Force 2 started, so for me, this was a really monumental time in my Star Wars fandom.
You've taken your first step into a larger world.
The realization that there were so many other characters that I wasn't aware of is really what, propelled me to be such a collector today. And I really thank Brian for that moment. So, why are we looking at these PVC non-articulated figures from Applause? Well, the reason is because this was the first line that actually had a Wedge Antilles figure. They came out in the early 90s, and while Wedge never had a figure in the vintage line, he got one in Applause vinyl PVC line, even with a removable helmet, and I think 1 point of articulation on the arm, it swiveled, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong. No, it definitely did. You can see the swivel point there. So, yeah, an interesting choice because he was starting to creep into merchandise for the first time. And I think a lot of fans at the same kind of age when they were in high school and starting college were now discovering that Star Wars was a little deeper. And Hasbro kind of took advantage of this by including Wedge in with the Millennium Falcon carrying case. And we got our very first Wedge Antilles action figure. But there's a catch. Like with all things that, fans have been waiting for a long, long time, of course there's going to be some strings involved. And, first off, this wasn't Wedge in his X-Wing outfit, which is how he's obviously well known from A New Hope. He's also Red Leader in Return of the Jedi, helping to lead the Battle of Endor, along with Lando as Gold Leader. And Wedge also shows up in Rogue Squadron on Endor. Hoth. Know your planet, Scott. So if you'll notice, and I know this is Luke here, there are differences between the X-Wing outfit and the snowspeeder outfit. The snowspeeder outfit is more, padded, if you will, because, they're cold. And the X-Wing figure released of Luke in Power of the Force 2 was actually a snowspeeder Luke. It was not X-Wing Luke. The photo is X-Wing Luke, but the figure was snowspeeder Luke. You can go watch the video about that. So while there's a lot of stuff about fake Wedge out there and real Wedge, there was another issue because not only were we not getting this to be, X-Wing Wedge, our first Wedge figure was Snowspeeder Wedge, and he was released in an odd way with a Millennium Falcon, which he never stepped foot in, and on this weird blister that had to be shaped in this odd polygon in order to fit into the Millennium Falcon's cockpit so you could see his face through the grill of the cockpit, if you will. All right, but there's another catch. It isn't just one catch, but this is a quadruple or at least a double catch. There was a big oops with this figure. It's probably one of the biggest oops of the entire line. I'm not talking about tan-vested Luke here. Well, when Wedge first came out, he got a new face, a new head sculpt on the Snowspeeder Luke body, but the helmet was Luke's. The helmet was painted as Luke's helmet. You can see the difference here. Luke's helmet in the back and Wedge's in the front. Wedge has two big green sections, and Luke has the Rebel Alliance symbol. Now, all of the X-Wing pilots had different helmets. It was really one of the only ways to differentiate them on screen and eventually as action figures. It's one of my favorite parts about them. I love collecting X-Wing pilots, and I love how all the helmets are different and the way they're detailed. So eventually, Wedge was updated as a running change. The white was removed from his sleeves, which you can see here in the first release, and the helmet was changed from Luke's deco to Wedge's correct deco. But this meant two sort of different Wedge figures and a legitimate variant. You can see the real big differences here, especially look at the sleeve, the way the white was on the Luke helmet deco, and there was no white on the Wedge helmet. Again, now here you can see them compared with the original Luke release. So he got a new head sculpt, but yeah, some interesting deco, call it accidents, both with that white stripe and with the wrong helmet. Fortunately, this wouldn't be Wedge's only chance to have an articulated action figure. This was just really his entry into the action figure world. He would eventually get quite a few in the modern, I won't say Power of the Force, but really the modern Star Wars line, because it changed name quite often, Saga Collection, Original Trilogy Collection, Vintage Collection. In fact, the Vintage Collection Wedge is probably one of the best Wedge figures. It's an existing X-Wing pilot body that was reused, but it got a face sculpt that was really on for Dennis Lawson, and the helmet was painted quite nicely. And in fact, we officially actually got a Wedge in his snowspeeder outfit, which was noted as this in the 3 3/4 Black Series, before Black Series was just 6-inch. So you can see X-Wing Luke and snowspeeder Luke here, Wedge, side by side. The snowspeeder one, I think, has the best helmet because the green is really green as opposed to kind of a grayish green on the X-Wing in the Vintage series. But it's nice that we did get both. In fact, we even got kind of a civilian Wedge in one of the comic packs that was paired with a Bothan. The Bothan spies that many of them died to bring us this news. Yep, that's what a Bothan looks like. Who knew? So, there's not much to say about the case. It's basically similar to the Darth Vader and C-3PO cases that it swings open, you put your figures inside, and yay. But with so many figures coming out in the hundreds and thousands, case was pretty obsolete quickly. But hey, it provided us with our very first Wedge Antilles action figure. Okay, it wasn't the very first Wedge figure, and I guess this might be considered an action figure since it did have one swivel point, but this was just the beginning. Wedge was becoming more recognizable to fans, and he was showing up in a lot of lines. And much like how I discovered Wedge in the early 90s and realized he was kind of a gateway to a much larger Star Wars world, well, the toy makers definitely followed suit and started using Wedge in a lot of lines. So we did get a very quintessential Wedge in his snowspeeder outfit, but that first one, the one with the odd paint job and the white sleeves, hey, it'll always be a very special figure for me personally because it really symbolized the renaissance of my love for Star Wars.